I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. Uranus-Neptune. Susskind presents his holographic string theory, including the megaverse of universes, as evidence against the need for an intelligent psyche to fine-tune the physical constants of nature required for life to exist in the universe. Nevertheless, his theory mirrors and thereby supports the Vedic Platonic Jungian cosmology. Moreover, the historical fact that his holographic string theory of a sea of bubble universes coincidentally emerged when Uranus and Neptune were conjunct relative to Earth can be presented as an example of astrological synchronicity, which inherently points to the meaningful union of mind and matter in the mandala manifesting archetype of the self. Suskind's theory furthermore provides a plausible cosmological mechanism to explain synchronicities. Every event in spacetime is occurring simultaneously at each point of the holographic film at the cosmic horizon, from where the cinematic hologram of our three-dimensional life on Earth is cast by fundamental strings of energy. So I just reiterated what I said on the previous slide, but it's worthy of being reiterated because we're looking for publicly accessible empirical evidence for synchronicities. All synchronicities point to the ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which I am equating with the psyche equals singularity equation. The whole purpose of this class is to help us take a leap of faith in the truth of the psyche equals singularity equation, and I'm saying, looking at astrological alignments within the context of holographic string theory, especially when we synthesize it with Jungian psychology, makes that leap of faith in the psyche equals singularity equation that much easier. Continuing with the theme of synchronicities in string theory, Leonard Susskind himself says, quote, "The discovery of string theory, which in a sense is still ongoing, was full of twists of fate, reversals of fortune, and serendipity." So that's in the Cosmic Landscape, page 204. Serendipity is fortunate discoveries made by accident. In an earlier slide, I discussed this serendipitous discovery of the Euler beta function and how that was seen to correlate with the strong nuclear force. So I'm going to read that again. This is from my book, Psyche and Singularity. This is on page 238. So I'll just read a little bit more to show how synchronicities and string theory work together. Not only does string theory provide the cosmology within which string theory makes sense, but a string of synchronicities or meaningful coincidences led to the discovery of holographic string theory. So let me read what I read before on a previous slide. As Brian Greene explains in The Elegant Universe, the series of what can be recognized as synchronicities most directly related to Susskind's string theory began to emerge in 1968 when the Italian physicist Gabriele Veneziano, then working at CERN, fortuitously discovered that, quote, "An esoteric formula concocted for purely mathematical pursuits by the renowned Swiss mathematician Leonard Euler some 200 years earlier, the so-called Euler beta function, seemed to describe numerous properties of strongly interacting particles in one fell swoop." So then I say that Euler in the late 18th century had no intention of mathematically mirroring the strong nuclear force, which was not discovered until 1932, powerfully supports Jung and Paoli's theory that the mirror symmetries between the mathematical world of numbers and the physical world of things inevitably emerge from the underlying archetypes. Citing similar examples of mathematical formulas preceding the discovery of the physical processes they mirror, Danzig, the historian of mathematics whom Einstein admired, he worked at the University of Maryland, it was back in the 1920s and 30s, I believe, he writes that, quote, "The mathematician may be compared to a designer of garments who is utterly oblivious of the creatures whom his garments may fit." So that's an interesting point. Mathematicians discover these interesting mathematical formulas, and then later physicists discover that those mathematical formulas describe a particular part of nature. For example, the Euler beta function, some mathematical formula that was discovered 200 years before string theory was discovered, was found to describe the strong interactions within the nucleus of an atom. Now, continuing with this synchronicities, Leonard Susskind's involved with one himself, so I'm continuing to read here from Psyche and Singularity. Green goes on to explain that 2 years after Veneziano accidentally discovered the correlation between Euler's formula and the strong force, Yoichiro Nambu, Holger Nielsen, and Leonard Susskind, each independently, now this is a quote from Green, showed that if one modeled elementary particles as little vibrating one-dimensional strings, their nuclear interactions could be described exactly by Euler's function. Those strings, which were discovered in 1969, that's the original version of string theory, which was then reinvented by Susskind and others on a much smaller scale where the strings are down at the Planck scale, too small to be empirically observed. Those are the strings of holographic string theory. But it took these steps of development, beginning with this fortuitous discovery of the parallel between Euler's beta function and the strong nuclear force. Then if they said, oh, let's look at these particles and see them not as particles but tiny elastic strings, then this correlation between the Euler beta function and the strong nuclear force was even stronger. But the point is, synchronicities. Even Leonard Susskind acknowledges that serendipities and reversals of fortune and twists of fate were involved in his string theory. So I'm going to go back and read more from Psyche and Singularity. I say it seems that the serendipitous correlation between Suskind's atheistically presented string theory and Jung's transpersonally oriented psychology is the ultimate reversal of fortune in the history of string theory, the inevitable enantiodromia before the final union of opposites. 2 roads for further investigation: NDEs and astrology. In a letter Jung wrote to A.D. Cornell on February 9, 1960, he lists 2 specific kinds of research that may provide empirical evidence for his synchronicity theory. Here's his quote: 2 roads for further investigation exist: 1, experiment, and 2, the study of case material. Under certain conditions, it is possible to experiment with archetypes, as my astrological experiment has shown. And then the idea of the study of case material, he says this would require the observation of individual cases of death, severe illness, and serious accidents. So how can you find empirical evidence for his theory of synchronicity, which depends on his deeper theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious mind, from which the laws of mind and the laws of matter both emerge, which is why there's a mirror symmetry between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics? What kind of empirical evidence can be publicly displayed so that everybody can see it for themselves? Where's the evidence for that? He's saying, well, astrology and near-death experiences, which makes sense, I'm going to say on these next few slides, because that's how Plato ended his most famous dialogue, The Republic, with the myth of which combines a near-death experience and allusions to astrology. Plato's Republic and the myth of NDEs, astrology, and string theory, in a way that is especially similar to Suskind's string theory. In the NDE, known as the myth of at the end of Plato's Republic, the information describing the past, present, and future of each soul's biography is encoded in the form of threads that are connected to the outermost hemisphere first, then to each concentric rim representing the planetary orbits around Earth, as opposed to the 5 elements that we saw in the Timaeus, for example, and in the Upanishads. So in this image of the universe, I'll be reading from Plato's Republic in a moment, but the spherical universe is seen as a hemisphere. It's a sphere cut in half so that we can see the concentric spheres within it. Each concentric sphere represents one of the orbits of the planets around the Earth. It's a geocentric model. So continuing with the slide, more specifically, the soldier named perceived the spindle of necessity pierced through the center of a series of nested bowls representing the orbits of the planets around Earth, and 3 sister goddesses, the Fates, representing past, present, and future, turning the orbits while handling each soul's thread of destiny. As we will see, Plato makes allusions to astrology. So one of the major themes of this whole class is that the history of philosophy in the Western world has come full circle back to Plato's cosmology. And that gives support to Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's theory that science emerges from the same archetypes as philosophy and as religion and mythology. And that the academic curriculum Plato set out in the Republic, the mathematical study of astronomy in order to open the eye of the soul ultimately to the idea of the good, which is the source of light in the visible world and the source of consciousness in the spiritual world, That mathematical curriculum was followed to its extreme by Leonard Susskind and Gerard 't Hooft, who defeated Stephen Hawking in the Black Hole War, and in doing so, they've brought us full circle back to Plato's cosmology. So, as a major theme, and we will be reiterating that theme now. So let me read a little bit from Plato's Republic. This is book 10, and it's the myth of So actually, let me just recall a previous slide that we went over. The tunnels, 2 tunnels on the ground and 2 tunnels up in the sky. We talked about this, tunnel visions and near-death experiences. So he's a soldier who woke up in his own funeral pyre. He was about to be incinerated, and he recalled his journey to the afterlife, where the guardians of that world told him, we want you to observe what happens so that you can go back and tell people about this. The first thing he saw was they walked to some extreme point of the earth, and on the ground they saw 2 openings, and above in the heavens 2 others, and there were judges there judging the sins of these souls, and the evil ones were told to go down one of the holes, and the good ones were told to go up in the heavens into another hole. At the same time, souls who had spent their 1,000-year journey either above or below the earth were coming back. The ones coming back from heaven came down pure and fresh looking and talked about these beautiful, indescribable things that they had seen, and the souls coming back up from the earth were grimy and covered in soot and traumatized, and they told about the horrors that they endured down in the underworld. So I mentioned how these openings and the long journey that the souls had to go through after entering them indicates the same kind of a tunnel vision that people talk about in near-death experiences, which I related to the relativistic effects of tunnel vision. But in this slide, I just want to make the correlations between the threads of destiny, outermost horizon of the cosmos, being woven down to the central earth. That's the main point I'm trying to make. So we've seen that these souls get judged, and now they're coming back. The ones who have returned after their 1,000-year journey then camp out in this meadow, and goes with them. So we're going to pick up from there. Now I'm reading from Francis MacDonald Cornford's translation and with notes of the Republic. It's from Oxford University Press. I chose his translation because he says clearly the word thread of destiny, and also because he has notes describing the spindle of necessity, which is a complicated issue because on the one hand it appears to be the straight shaft piercing through the center of the universe, and on the other hand it seems to be some kind of a rope wrapping around the circumference of the universe. So let me just read this. It's important to get into these details because saying that this most important dialogue of Plato's canon ends with such a perfect summation of all the main ingredients of Leonard Suskind's string theory and the fusion with Carl Jung's psychology, including his near-death experience. So reading from Cornford's translation of the myth of he says, "Now when each company had spent 7 days in the meadow, on the 8th day they had to rise up and journey on, and on the 4th day afterwards they came to a place where they could see a straight shaft of light, like a pillar, stretching from above throughout heaven and earth, more like the rainbow than anything else, but brighter and purer. To this they came after a day's journey, and there, at the middle of the light, they saw stretching from heaven the extremities of its chains, for this light binds the heavens, holding together all the revolving firmament like the undergirths of a ship of war." So the undergirths of a ship of war are ropes that they used to tie around the hull of trireme, the ship of war, to bind up the boards so they wouldn't come apart during the stress of travel through the sea. So in the back of the ship, they would have some kind of a device to twist the rope. Its beginning and its end point would go around this device, and they'd twist it to create the tension to gird the ship together. So here we have this idea of a straight shaft of light, like a pillar, which you would think of as a column going vertically, and yet the image of this rope around the circumference of the cosmos. I'll be reading again from Psyche and Singularity, where I talk about potential correlation with the optical deformations seen around a black hole in a moment. But with that preface in place, let me continue reading from the myth of "And from the extremities stretched the spindle of necessity, by means of which all the circles revolve. The shaft of the spindle and the hook were of adamant, and the whorl partly of adamant and partly of other substances. The whorl was of this fashion. In shape it was like an ordinary whorl, but from account we must imagine it as a large whorl with the inside completely scooped out, and within it a second smaller whorl, and a third and a fourth and 4 more, fitting into one another like a nest of bowls. For there were in all 8 worlds, set one within another, with their rims showing above as circles and making up the continuous surface of a single whirl round the shaft, which pierces right through the center of the 8th. So then he talks about the relative sizes, widths of the rims of these worlds, and they correlate to the orbits of the planets. So the worlds on the outermost worlds, the fixed stars, the constellations of the zodiac, and then it's Saturn and Jupiter and Mars and Venus and Mercury and the Sun and the Moon. I believe I got them correct. And this myth and the velocities of the spinning of these concentrically nested bowls account for the differences of the orbits of the planets and the brightness of the planets that we see from the central Earth. It's a geocentric cosmology. So after describing all those orbits and the relative sizes of the rims, the story continues. The spindle turned on the knees of necessity. Necessity is the goddess Ananke. Upon each of its circles stood a siren, who was carried round with its movement, uttering a single sound on one note, so that all 8 made up the concords of a single scale. Round about at equal distances were seated each on a throne the 3 daughters of necessity, the Fates, robed in white with garlands on their heads, Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos, chanting to the siren's music, Lachesis of things past, Clotho of the present, and Atropos of things to come. And from time to time Clotho lays her right hand on the outer rim of the spindle and helps to turn it, while Atropos turns the inner circles likewise with her left hand, and Lachesis with either hand takes hold of inner and outer alternately. Now you've got 2 images which Cornford talks about in his appendix and in his footnotes. You've got the rope going around the circumference of the cosmos, like the ropes that held warships together, and then you've got this idea of a rainbow-colored pillar of light piercing through this nested bowl of the orbits of the planets centered on Earth. And he mentions a hook. So a spindle, I looked at various videos about this, tutorials on YouTube. A drop spindle is what is being discussed here if you want to get a better idea of what this image is. A drop spindle is just a shaft, a circular tube-like shaft of wood, and at the bottom there's a whorl, just a circle of wood around the shaft, and then at the very far end of the shaft is a hook. And you take the fibers of the material like cotton and you stretch it out and you pull it into a kind of a string and you wrap it around the hook, and then you hold the hook up with this drafted fiber above the spindle and you twist the spindle. And that spinning of the spindle twists the fiber into a thread. And then when you've got your thread that's long enough, you then pull it back down and you lash it over the whorl and wrap it around the shaft on the other end opposite of the hook. And then you pull some more of your drafted fiber and you pull it back around to the other side, hook it onto the hook, turn the whole ensemble upside down again, and then spin the spindle and make the thread. So the imagery is not meant to be exact. Clearly Plato's already mixing the imagery of the rope around a warship and the idea of a spindle. I think most people in Greece obviously would have known what a spindle is. That's how they made their clothes. So he's just using an everyday image. And there's the thread of destiny. So the thing I want to focus on is simply there's the thread of destiny, which makes contact with the outermost perimeter of the universe and each of the concentric spheres of the orbits of the planets around the central Earth down to the central Earth. This thread, whether it's woven into the rims or touches the rims or is psychically connected to the rims because the Fates are holding the thread while they're singing and touching the rims, it's not clear exactly. But what is clear is that there is a thread of destiny attached to each soul, and it starts out at the cosmic horizon. It travels through these planetary orbits back to the Earth. So Carl Jung, during his near-death experience, says that it seemed to him that each of us on Earth is imprisoned in our own little cube of three-dimensional illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread where the past, the present, and the future coexist. We saw in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad the idea of the thread soul woven into the outermost sphere of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future exist. We seem to be seeing the same kind of a cosmological model here in the myth of Ur. One thing to note is that instead of the spherical universe that we see in the Timaeus, here it's a hemisphere, a sphere cut in half along its equator, which enables us to observe the rims of these orbits around the Earth. Cornford and others say that it's probably still meant to be a spherical universe. We're looking at it as a hemisphere so that we can appreciate the inner workings of the orbits around the Earth. If you combine the cosmology of the Timaeus with the Republic, which includes the threads of destiny, then you have something a lot more closely resembling holographic string theory. If you remember in the Timaeus, it was clearly said that the absolute ideas exist out at the mother substance, the outermost sphere of the horizon of the cosmos. And in the Phaedrus, the same thing is seen. During a near-death experience in between lives, some souls can take their winged chariot out to the outermost sphere of the cosmos and see the absolute ideas there. So if you combine these various cosmologies of the different dialogues, you get a really close resemblance to a fusion of Susskind's holographic string theory and Carl Jung's psychology, especially his near-death experience. The myth of reincarnation, and the thread of destiny. According to account, lots are cast on the ground in front of the group of souls with whom he is traveling. The number each receives determines the order in which each soul gets to choose from the inventory of next lives, which are also cast before them. After all the souls, influenced by the habits of their past lives, had chosen their next lives, the daemon, translated as deity or demon, a kind of guardian angel associated with each life, led its respective soul first to the outermost sphere of the cosmos, to Clotho, under her hand as it turned the whirling spindle, thus ratifying the portion which the man had chosen when his lot was cast. And after touching her, he led it next to the spinning of Atropos, thus making the thread of destiny irreversible. So if you'll recall, Clotho would turn the outermost sphere, the outermost hemisphere of the spindle, and Atropos would turn the inner spheres, or the planetary orbits centered around Earth. The spindle pierces through the center of the Earth. So you see the main points are that there's a thread of destiny and that there are singing sirens on each of these orbits of the planets around the central Earth, and that the thread of destiny is being handled by Clotho, who's in charge of the outermost perimeter of the cosmos, and by Atropos, and they're both singing. So they're singing along with the harmony of the sirens, who are forming an octave of musical notes correlating to the orbits of the planets. So the information seems to be transmitted to the thread of destiny by this singing. The vibration of the string theory, quantum particles that we perceive are actually tiny little elastic strings wrapped around the compactified extra dimensions of space in Calabi-Yau manifolds. And Michio Kaku said, the universe is like a symphony of vibrating strings, and each quantum particle is like a note played on a vibrating string, that all of the different particles can be reduced to a string, just like all of the different notes of music come from a single string. So we have this clear parallel between the myth of and holographic string theory. So now I just want to read a little bit more. In the previous slide we talked about the contradiction between the spindle of necessity, which is a rainbow shaft of light, being described as a rope around the circumference of the cosmos, and at the same time like a pillar piercing through the nested worlds. So I'm going to return to Psyche and Singularity, where I write about that in an endnote 690. So I say, notice how the rainbow pillar that runs vertically through the center of the universe is also compared to a trireme, the rope that runs around the hull of a ship and can be tightened by a mechanism to keep the ship's frame together under the stress of the sea. So now I read from a physicist, Luminet, from the Paris Observatory, if I recall correctly, Jean-Pierre Luminet, his book The Wrapped Around Universe, where he talks about the optical deformations caused by the gravity of a black hole. He says, let us take a black hole and a thin disk of gas viewed from the side, either by a distant observer or a photographic plate. So an accretion disk, black holes, if they're spinning, when material falls into the black hole, if there's too much of it, it gets thrown around the equator of the black hole, and the friction of the particles becomes so intense that it glows bright. It's called an accretion disk. And at the same time, something that Luminet doesn't mention, relativistic jets, compacted jets of energy shoot out like a spindle from both sides, up and down. There's pictures of this, these rapidly moving jets of energy. So there's a possibility of interpreting this contradiction in the myth of the spindle of necessity being a rope around the cosmos and a shaft piercing through its middle. If we see the lap of necessity, Ananke, as a supermassive black hole, and the spindle as a relativistic jet shooting through the middle of that black hole, and the idea of an accretion disk and how it would appear to people observing it. So continuing with Luminae, he says, in an ordinary situation, meaning in Euclidean space, the curvature is weak. This is the case for the solar system. One observes the planet Saturn surrounded by its magnificent rings with a viewpoint situated slightly above the planet. But one can mentally reconstruct their ecliptic outlines quite easily. So if you're looking at Saturn and you see the rings around Saturn, you don't see the rings on the opposite side of Saturn because it's blocked by the planet itself. But you can imagine what they would look like. So continuing with Luminae, he says, around a black hole everything behaves differently because of the optical deformations due to the curvature of space-time. So the gravity around a black hole is so intense that it plays tricks with light. It bends it and wraps it around the black hole before you can see it. Strikingly, we see the top of the disk in its totality, whatever the angle from which we view it may be. The back part of the disk is not hidden by the black hole, since the images that come from it are lifted to some extent by the spatial curvature and reach the distant observer. Much more astonishing, one also sees the bottom of the gaseous disk. In fact, the light rays that normally propagate downwards in a direction opposite to that of the observer climb back to the top and provide a secondary image, a highly deformed picture of the bottom of the disk. In theory, there is a tertiary image that gives an extremely distorted view of the top after the light rays have completed 3 half-turns, then an image of order 4 that gives a view of the bottom that is even more squashed, and so on to infinity. To describe this final image, no caption fits better than these verses by Gerard de Nerval, written a century and a half ago. So this poem, which is titled La Christ Olivier, seems very similar to the myth of and Luminae is comparing this poem to the view of a black hole's accretion disk being wrapped around and around the black hole before the observer can see it. So in his poem, Gerard de Nerval says, in seeking the eye of God, I saw naught but an orbit, vast, black, and bottomless, from which the night which there lives shines on the world and continually thickens. A strange rainbow surrounds this somber well, threshold of the ancient chaos, whose offspring is shadow, a spiral engulfing worlds and days. So that seems to be a pretty good description of a black hole. Vast, black, and bottomless, and it's a spiral. So a spinning black hole, things spiral into it, that creates the accretion disk. And how would you see the accretion disk? Luminae is saying this poem helps you see it. It's like a rainbow wrapped around the perimeter of the accretion disk. So that's just a potential solution to the paradoxes of the myth of And I'm trying to show the correlations between Plato's cosmology and black hole cosmology, so I think that helps. But continuing with this analysis of the myth of itself, the idea of lots being cast on the ground in front of the group. So let me go back and read from Cornford's translation of the myth of So he says, the souls, as soon as they came, were required to go before Lachesis, an interpreter first marshal them in order, and then having taken from the lap of Lachesis a number of lots and samples of lives, he mounted on a high platform and said, the word of Lachesis, maiden daughter of necessity. Souls of a day, here shall begin a new round of earthly life, to end in death. No guardian spirit will cast lots for you, but you shall choose your own destiny. Let him to whom the first lot falls choose first a life to which he will be bound of necessity. But virtue owns no master. As a man honors or dishonors her, so shall he have more or less of her. The blame is his who chooses. Heaven is blameless. So with that, they threw these lots down. The souls picked up whichever one fell closest to them. That gave them a number. Then according to the number, they got to choose first, second, third, or last. And then a series of future lives were cast on the ground. And the person who chose lot number 1 got to choose first. And what determined what life they chose usually was the habits of their previous life. And often the souls who had come up from the ground and had suffered horribly the tortures of the demons down there, they often chose more prudently a life of virtue, whereas the souls who came down from heaven and were used to an easy life of beauty and pleasure were more often duped into choosing a life that might have been tyrannical in the beginning and then might end horribly, like you had to eat your children or something. So with that in mind, Socrates stops the narration for a moment and he turns to Glaucon, who is one of Plato's older brothers, and he says, here it seems, my dear Glaucon, a man's whole fortunes are at stake. On this account each one of us should lay aside all other learning to study only how he may discover one who can give him the knowledge enabling him to distinguish the good life from the evil, and always and everywhere to choose the best within his reach, taking into account all these qualities we have mentioned, and how, separately or in combination, they affect the goodness of life. So the most important thing we should do is train ourselves how to choose a good life, in this life and in the next. Soul chooses a life, and Socrates talks about Ajax, the hero, the warrior hero. He chose the life of a lion. Some animals chose the lives of humans. Some humans, thinking human life was too hard, chose what they thought was the easier life of animals. Odysseus was the last one to choose, and he chose the life of a humble, simple man. Continuing with the myth of Now when all the souls had chosen their lives, they went in the order of their lots to Lachesis, and she gave each into the charge of the guardian genius he had chosen to escort him through life and fulfill his choice. The genius led the soul first to Clotho, under her hand as it turned the whirling spindle, thus ratifying the portion which the man had chosen when his lot was cast. And after touching her, he led it next to the spinning of Atropos, thus making the thread of destiny irreversible. So that's the main point to focus on for the correlations between string theory and the myth of We've gone over these details a few times now, so one last time. Clotho, her hand turns the outermost orbit of the fixed stars. Atropos turns the inner concentric orbits of the planetary spheres around the central Earth. The thread of destiny is handled somehow, either psychically. Socrates doesn't mention her holding it. She's singing along with the harmony of the sirens who are on the 8 concentric spheres, which are also rotating. So the information seems to be correlated with the musical sound vibrations. At any rate, there's some contact between the thread of destiny, Clotho, and Atropos, who are handling these concentric orbits centered on the Earth. The myth of clear astrological connotations. In an endnote to his translation of the Republic, Robin Waterfield interprets the passage about Clotho and Atropos from the myth of astrologically. Here's what he has to say. Perhaps we are to imagine one of them spinning the warp and the other the woof of a person's life. There are clear astrological connotations to the passage. The word translated destiny also means, or came to mean, degree on the zodiacal circle. Ratify is cognate with the rulership of a planet. In short, as well as setting an individual's destiny in a more abstract sense, the fates do so according to the positions of the planets, Atropos, and the zodiacal signs, Clotho. Note that, despite Plato's use of the word unalterable, it is only the broad framework which is fixed. The whole of Plato's philosophy leaves room for self-improvement within that framework. So we here have astrological connotations in the myth of We have the thread of destiny, which is touching the outermost perimeter, just like in holographic string theory. It's traversing through the concentric orbits of the planets, which is also consistent with holographic string theory, which says that any information in any three-dimensional volume of space is conserved at the two-dimensional surface area. So you can consider the solar system as a series of concentric volumes of space correlating to the orbits of the planets. Usually we think of it in a heliocentric way, but you can think of it in any way. You can think of the solar system from a Venus-centric way if you want to. It's just your free choice. Here on Earth, it's natural for us to see everything orbiting around us. The point is, the parallels with holographic string theory seem pretty clear, especially when you combine the myth of with the cosmology of the spherical universe containing a central soul that encompasses the outer horizon where the absolute ideas are in the Timaeus, which is reaffirmed in the Phaedrus. The myth of prototype of the young Suscan synthesis. The three fates, who represent past, present, and future, connect the thread of each soul's destiny, first with the zodiacal signs at the cosmic horizon, and then with the rim of each concentric orbit of the planets centering on Earth, indicating that our karmic fate is astrologically correlated with the planetary archetypes. The threads of destiny contain the information required for each psyche's fate to unfold on Earth, and the fates sing while connecting that information from the outermost sphere of fixed stars through each planetary orbit, each of which carries a single siren to the central Earth. The myth of combines and therefore presages all of the main ingredients of the Jung-Susskind synthesis: a near-death experience, the astrological concept of planetary archetypes, and musical vibrations imparting information to fundamental threads that are connected to and conserved at the cosmic horizon and each concentric boundary of geocentric space. So there's a summary of the correlations between holographic string theory and the myth of The main focus of the previous slides and this slide is synchronicity. Again, all synchronicities or meaningful coincidences point to the ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, because it seems to indicate a union of meaning-perceiving minds and the physical world. Mind and matter are the overarching pair of opposites. All of the different emotional oppositions, like happy and sad, that you can feel can be categorized under the broad umbrella of mind. And all of the physical polarities, like hot and cold, can be categorized under the overarching category of matter. So when you see this apparent union of mind and matter in a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence of meaning-perceiving minds in the physical world, it points to the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So every synchronicity should remind us of the God archetype, and in addition to providing support for the theory of astrological synchronicities, the myth of also fulfills Jung and Susskind's theory that science and philosophy and mythology and religion, they all emerge from the same underlying archetypes, so that any scientific discovery you might have will have some kind of a mythological precursor. And I'm saying the myth of is one of those precursors of holographic string theory. Astrology and the archetypal eye. Thus, the study of archetypal forms opens the archetypal eye. This is what Richard Tarnas says in Cosmos and Psyche. When you study astrological synchronicities, little by little, it's helping you open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, and that's the ultimate goal of education. In the interpretive essay attached to his translation of the Republic of Plato, Alan Bloom responds as follows to Socrates' derogatory claim that anyone can be an imitator like Homer by reproducing the world in a mirror. Bloom says no ordinary mirror can reflect the gods. So Homer is such a great poet that when he writes his words, you can see what he's describing in your mind. When he describes the rosy-tipped fingers of dawn, you can see it in your mind's eye. Socrates says, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Guess what? If I take a mirror, boom, look at that. Perfect replication of the beautiful rosy-fingered dawn. Astrology is the mirror that enables us to see the gods intelligibly reflected in the meaningful correlations between the orbits of the planets and the cycles of dramatic life on Earth. As the planets reflect the visible sun, so do the planetary gods or archetypes reflect the spiritual sun, the idea of the good. If you recall the cave allegory, after the prisoner's hauled out of the cave, he's blinded by the light of the sun. He can only see things at night. Then he can start to see things as they're reflected in puddles. He can even see the sun itself reflected in a puddle. Eventually then he can look at the sun itself. I am saying that the planetary archetypes and the way they correlate with the unfolding of dramatic life on Earth, that's a reflection of the spiritual sun, the idea of the good in which all archetypes are combined. So when you study astrology, it's like looking at a puddle and looking at the reflection of the sun, looking at a reflection of the idea of the good. I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.